The scream came again, sharper this time, unmistakably feminine, and it originated from somewhere within the manor house itself, rather than from any of the grounds. There was that peculiar moment of collective hesitation that overtakes a group when faced with genuine distress. A moment where social training and ordinary caution wrestle with instinctive concern for another's welfare. It was Father William who moved first, setting down his teacup with a decisive clink and moving toward the stone terrace with the purposefulness of a man accustomed to attending to crises. Several others followed in his wake, including Dr. Ashton, whose professional training overrode any social uncertainty. Miss Marple, however, remained seated for precisely 3 more seconds, observing the reactions of those around her before rising with the careful deliberation of advanced age, noting that Eleanor Whitmore's face had gone quite pale beneath her carefully applied cosmetics, that David Whitmore had abandoned his station at the refreshment tent without explanation, and that Marjorie Finch appeared to be trembling, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The movement toward the manor created a peculiar vacuum in the gathering, a space where ordinary social conventions momentarily dissolved, leaving people to stand in small, confused clusters, uncertain whether to follow or remain where they were. Thomas Carstairs stood motionless, his jaw tightened in a way that suggested either concern or something rather more complicated. The interior of Thornfield Manor was familiar to many of the villagers, having been opened for the village charity tour the previous autumn, and it was toward the library that the crowd seemed instinctively drawn, as though some collective understanding had led them all to the same destination. The library was a grand room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and tall windows that overlooked the gardens, and it was there that they found the source of the commotion. Edmund Harrow, Eleanor Whitmore's brother, and the unofficial curator of the family's considerable art collection, lay sprawled across the Persian carpet near the fireplace, his face an alarming shade of grey-blue, his breathing absent, his left arm extended as though reaching for something just beyond his grasp. A small table had been overturned near his body, and on the floor beside him lay scattered several sheets of paper and what appeared to be a fountain pen, its cap still in place. Dr. Ashton knelt immediately, checking for a pulse with professional precision, and then looked up at the assembled crowd with an expression that required no words. Eleanor Whitmore made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a moan, and David moved quickly to his aunt's side, placing a steadying hand on her elbow. Father William crossed himself with automatic solemnity. It was Margaret Carstairs who noticed, almost immediately, the curious dampness on the library's stone threshold, a threshold that led from the library's French doors to the terrace outside, the very same terrace that overlooked the gardens where they had all been gathered mere minutes before. The dampness formed an irregular pattern, shaped almost like a footprint, dark against the pale stone, and it was already beginning to dry in the morning air. This detail registered in Miss Marple's consciousness with the quiet authority of an observation that would prove significant, though she kept her gaze carefully neutral and continued to approach the scene with the measured pace of an elderly woman paying her respects to the departed. The police were summoned, of course, though by the time the local constable, Sergeant Matthew Price, arrived some 20. Minutes later in his small blue car, the body had not been moved, and the scene had remained largely undisturbed, which was testament to Father William's quiet authority in persuading the assembled crowd to maintain their distance. Sergeant Price was a methodical man of perhaps 50 years, competent rather than brilliant, with the kind of steady reliability that inspired confidence in elderly women and irritation in those with more elaborate plans. He immediately established a perimeter around the library, asked preliminary questions about who had discovered the body and when, and began the process of photographing the scene with a camera that seemed to require considerable concentration to operate correctly. Eleanor Whitmore, still visibly shocked, provided the information that Edmund had been expected that morning to review some newly acquired paintings that had arrived the previous day, that she had assumed he was in the library working when she left to greet arriving guests at the festival, and that no one, to her knowledge, had been in the manor during the morning hours, except for the household staff, who had all been occupied with final preparations and were now gathered anxiously in the servants' hall. Within an hour, the festival had been quietly dispersed, with Sergeant Price requesting that no one leave the village without providing their statement, a request that was met with the resigned acceptance of people accustomed to small-town disruptions. The guests filtered back through the gates with the peculiar mixture of fascination and embarrassment that violent death always inspired in peaceful communities, carrying with them speculation and theory, and a thirst for detail that would sustain village conversation for months to come. Miss Marple, accepting her grandniece's offer of a ride home, settled into the passenger seat and watched the manor recede behind. Them with an expression of mild sadness at the fragility of human life. Yet beneath that sadness, her mind was already working through the curious puzzle that Edmund Harrow's death presented. The damp footprint on stone, the overturned table, the fountain pen, the position of the body, the small anxieties visible in faces that moments before had been arranged in the comfortable masks of social gathering. She thought about fear and about secrets, about the ways that small communities bred resentments in their quiet spaces, and about how often the most ordinary moments preceded the most extraordinary revelations. The afternoon light fell across her lap as the car wound through the village streets toward St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple folded her hands and waited for the evening edition of the local newspaper, which would surely contain some preliminary account of what the police were already calling a death requiring investigation. The evening edition of the Thornfield Gazette, which appeared on doorsteps by 5:30, contained remarkably little concrete information, though this did nothing to diminish the appetite for speculation that had seized the village with the force of a particularly virulent influenza. The headline read, "Local businessman found dead at manor. Police investigate," a cautious formulation that managed to convey mystery while avoiding any definitive statement of fact. The article itself, composed by young Timothy Brennan, the newspaper's sole reporter, revealed that Edmund Harrow, aged 58, a respected businessman with interests in property development and art acquisition, had been discovered deceased in the library of Thornfield Manor at approximately noon, that the death was being treated as suspicious pending the results of a preliminary examination, and that Sergeant Price was appealing for anyone with relevant information to come forward. What the article failed to mention, but what the village was already beginning to piece together through the various accounts of those present, was that Edmund Harrow had been discovered with what appeared to be signs of poisoning, a detail that Margaret Carstairs had overheard Father William discussing with Dr. Ashton as they stood near the refreshment tent, and which she had naturally transmitted to her husband, who had mentioned it to the postman, who had distributed it throughout the village with the efficiency of a broadcasting service. By evening, Miss Marple had received 3 separate telephone calls from various acquaintances offering partial information and requests for her thoughts on the matter, a phenomenon she had long ago ceased to find surprising. Mrs. Bantry, who maintained the village's most elaborate network of social intelligence, called to report that Edmund Harrow had apparently been in the process of acquiring a significant collection of 17th-century paintings, and that there had been some question about the provenance of at least one piece. Mrs. Price, the sergeant's wife, had mentioned to her hairdresser that there had been a peculiar substance found in the library that the doctor believed might be relevant to the cause of death. And young Lucy Hartley, who worked part-time in the village chemist, had confided that Edmund Harrow had been, in the previous week, asking questions about the various poisons that could be detected only with difficulty in tea or coffee, a revelation that Lucy had promptly reported to her mother, who had naturally felt obligated to share it with anyone who might listen. Miss Marple received each of these communications with her characteristic blend of polite interest and careful non-commitment, offering neither opinion nor judgment, merely nodding thoughtfully and asking the occasional innocuous question that somehow managed to draw out considerably more information than her callers had initially intended to provide. By the time evening had fully descended and she had settled into her comfortable chair with her knitting, she had accumulated a rather comprehensive picture of Edmund Harrow's recent activities and relationships, though the significance of these observations remained, for the moment, obscured beneath layers of gossip and speculation. What emerged from this intelligence gathering was a portrait of a man whose business ventures had been increasingly successful, but whose personal relationships had become markedly strained. Edmund had been engaged in negotiations to purchase Thornfield Cottage from Margaret and Thomas Carstairs, a transaction that had apparently fallen through under circumstances that neither party was willing to discuss publicly, though the general understanding in the village was that Edmund had attempted to renegotiate the price downward after a preliminary agreement had been reached, a maneuver that had offended the Carstairs' sense of fair dealing. He had also been in contact with David Whitmore regarding some joint venture involving property development in the adjacent county, though this arrangement had apparently been abandoned several months prior after what Mrs. Bantry described as considerable unpleasantness. Edmund's relationship with his sister Eleanor had been cordial but distant, marked by the kind of polite formality that often masks deeper complications. He had maintained a residence in London, where he spent most of his time, visiting Thornfield Manor primarily for business purposes rather than family connection. Most intriguingly, he had apparently been involved in some form of romantic entanglement with a woman from the neighboring town, though the identity of this woman remained mysterious, as none of the village's informatio networks had yet managed to establish it with certainty. Miss Marple's knitting progressed with a steady rhythm that had become almost meditative over her many years of engaging in the craft simultaneously with observation and reflection. The needles clicked in a pattern that required no conscious attention, leaving her mind free to consider the various threads of information that had presented themselves. She found herself thinking about the curious detail of the damp footprint on the stone threshold, a detail that had been mentioned in her hearing but which Sergeant Price had apparently considered insignificant enough not to emphasize in his preliminary inquiries. She thought about the fountain pen, still capped, which suggested that Edmund had not been in the act of writing when he died but rather had abandoned his writing implement at some earlier point. She considered the position of his body, the overturned table, the scattered papers, a scene that suggested either a violent struggle or a careful arrangement designed to create the impression of struggle. She reflected on the faces she had observed at the festival, on the small tells of emotion that betrayed deeper preoccupations than gardening competitions. Thomas Carstairs' tightened jaw, David Whitmore's distracted attention, Marjorie Finch's trembling hands, Eleanor Whitmore's carefully maintained composure that seemed to require enormous effort, Dr. Ashton's professional distance that seemed almost rehearsed. The following morning, Sergeant Price would call at the manor to conduct more thorough interviews, and Miss Marple knew that within a matter of days some theory would emerge, probably focusing on Edmund's business entanglements or his romantic involvement, as these were the narratives that satisfied the public appetite for explanation. But she had learned over many years that the theories that satisfy the public appetite and the theories that explained the actual facts were often remarkably different propositions. The rain that had threatened all morning finally began to fall as she set aside her knitting, a gentle patter against the windows that would, she knew, completely obliterate any trace of that curious damp footprint on the manor's stone threshold. And Miss Marple found herself wondering if that was precisely what someone had been counting on. The rain continued throughout the night and into the following morning, a steady downpour that transformed the village streets into small rivers and discouraged all but the most necessary ventures outdoors. It was therefore somewhat surprising to Miss Marple when, at approximately 9:30 on that grey Wednesday morning, she received a visitor in the form of Sergeant Price himself, who arrived on her doorstep with his uniform darkened by moisture and his expression suggesting a man burdened by uncertainties he was reluctant to articulate. Miss Marple's housekeeper, Florence, showed him into the sitting room where Miss Marple had been engaged in her customary morning activity of correspondence, and the sergeant accepted the offer of tea with the gratitude of someone who had been out in inclement weather for some considerable time. It was only after Florence had departed and the preliminaries of weather commentary had been dispensed with that Sergeant Price revealed the true purpose of his visit, which was not, as Miss Marple had initially assumed, a formal interrogation regarding her observations at the festival, but rather something rather more delicate and uncertain in nature. The preliminary examination of Edmund Harrow's body had revealed the presence of a substance that Dr. Ashton had initially believed to be a form of plant-based poison, though the exact variety remained unclear pending laboratory analysis. from the county police's more sophisticated facilities. The curious detail, however, was that the substance appeared to have been administered several hours before Edmund's death, a timeline that suggested either a slow-acting poison or some form of deliberate delay in the victim's demise. Furthermore, the papers scattered near Edmund's body had proven to be preliminary sketches and notes related to the 17th-century paintings he had been acquiring, with no particular indication of distress or urgency in the handwriting. Most puzzling of all, from Sergeant Price's perspective, was the matter of access to the library during the morning hours. Eleanor Whitmore maintained that she had assumed Edmund was in the library working when she departed for the festival at approximately 9 o'clock, but she had not actually seen him at that time, having merely noticed that the library door was closed. The household staff, a cook, 2 housemaids, and a groundskeeper, had all been occupied with festival preparations and had not entered the library at any point during the morning. The French doors leading from the library to the terrace had been locked from the inside, as they always were. Yet someone had clearly entered and exited the library during a window of time that remained frustratingly difficult to establish with precision. Sergeant Price explained all of this to Miss Marple with the manner of a man hoping that some fragment of her observation might clarify the situation, though he was too experienced to directly request such assistance, as it would have suggested a lack of confidence in his own investigative abilities. Miss Marple listened with her characteristic attention, occasionally nodding and asking questions that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but which managed to extract considerably more detail than Sergeant Price had initially intended to provide. E. asked about the condition of the stone threshold with a damp footprint, a detail that caused the sergeant to pause and regard her with something approaching surprise, as this was not information that had been widely circulated. He explained that the footprint had been photographed and measured, that it appeared to be approximately a size 9 or 10, consistent with a man's shoe, and that the moisture suggested the person had stepped in water immediately before or after passing through the threshold, which indicated either entry from outside during or after rainfall, or an unusual amount of water being present in the library itself for some reason. Yet there had been no evidence of water or dampness anywhere in the library beyond that single footprint on the threshold. Miss Marple absorbed this information with a thoughtful expression, and then asked a question that seemed to the sergeant to be entirely irrelevant at first, but which, upon reflection, suggested a line of inquiry he had not previously considered. She inquired whether Edmund Harrow's shoes had been examined for evidence of water or mud, whether his clothing showed any signs of having been recently wet, whether the condition of his hair and the upper portion of his garments suggested exposure to rain. Sergeant Price had to confess that he had not ordered such an examination, as the body had been discovered indoors, and the assumption had been that it had remained indoors for the duration of the morning. Yet now that Miss Marple had raised the question, he realized that this assumption might be precisely that, an assumption rather than a demonstrated fact. A person could conceivably have been outside during the morning, could have stepped in water or mud, could have then entered the library and administered poison to themselves or been poisoned by someone within the house. Miss Marple suggested, very gentle, why, and with the air of someone merely thinking aloud, that it might be worth determining whether Edmund Harrow had taken a walk on the manor grounds at some point that morning, whether any of the staff had observed him going out or coming in, whether his shoes and the hem of his trousers bore any evidence of such a walk. She also mentioned, in what seemed to be almost an afterthought, that she had noticed on her previous visit to the manor that the stone threshold had appeared somewhat worn and uneven, and that certain individuals she had observed seemed to prefer walking around it rather than stepping directly upon it, an observation that might prove relevant if, for instance, someone had been attempting to disguise their footprints or footfall by deliberately avoiding a particular route. Sergeant Price departed approximately 40 minutes later, having consumed 2 cups of tea and having filled 3 pages of his notebook with observations and questions that he had not previously considered, though he was careful to maintain the appearance that these were his own deductions merely clarified through conversation with a thoughtful elderly woman. As his car disappeared through the rain toward Thornfield Manor, Miss Marple returned to her correspondence, though her mind was already engaged in the more complex task of considering the ways that a crime might be constructed to appear more elaborate than it actually was, and conversely, the ways that apparently simple details might conceal considerably more intricate arrangements of motive and method than initially appeared. By Friday afternoon, Sergeant Price had conducted a more thorough examination of Edmund Harrow's remains and had confirmed Miss Marple's subtle suggestion regarding his shoes and clothing. Edmund's shoes bore traces of mud from the manor's gardens, and microscopic examination had revealed particles of oil consistent with the flower beds near the library's French doors. His trouser cuffs showed signs of moisture, and his hair, while not entirely wet, bore evidence of having been exposed to rain at some point during the morning hours. This discovery fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation, as it suggested that Edmund had been outdoors during the morning, likely between 9 and 10 o'clock, and had therefore been alive and mobile at a time when Eleanor Whitmore had assumed him to be working in the library. The implications were considerable and somewhat troubling, as they indicated that either Eleanor had been mistaken in her assumptions or deliberately misleading in her statements, a distinction that carried vastly different consequences. Sergeant Price had also determined that the poison in question was indeed a plant-based substance, specifically derived from a rather uncommon climbing vine that grew in the southern regions of England, and that was, interestingly enough, cultivated in a small greenhouse adjoining the Thornfield Manor gardens. The greenhouse was maintained by Colin Hayes, the young groundskeeper, though Eleanor Whitmore had stated that she kept various botanical specimens there for purely aesthetic purposes, and that she was unaware of which plants might be toxic. This revelation had naturally redirected the focus of the investigation toward the manor itself and those who had access to its grounds and facilities, a narrowing of the investigative circle that had brought considerable tension into the village, as it meant that the murderer was almost certainly someone within the Whitmore family circle or their immediate household. Miss Marple learned of these developments through the village's ever-efficient information network, supplemented by a second visit from Sergeant Price on Saturday morning, during which he seemed considerably less certain of his investigative direction than he had been on his previous visit. He had come, he explained, because certain facts were troubling him and because he valued her perspective on matters of human behavior, though he was careful to frame this request in such a way that he appeared to be merely making conversation rather than soliciting her assistance. He described the interviews he had conducted with the household staff, and Miss Marple noted with interest that he seemed particularly concerned about certain inconsistencies in their accounts. The cook, Mrs. Helena Brown, had stated that she had seen Eleanor Whitmore in the kitchen at approximately 9:15, discussing final preparations for the festival. Yet the two housemaids, Susan and Margaret, had both indicated that Eleanor had departed the house at approximately 8:45 and had not returned until late afternoon. The groundskeeper, Colin Hayes, had mentioned seeing a man, presumably Edmund, walking in the gardens near the greenhouse at approximately 9:30, though he could not specify the precise time. Most intriguingly, Marjorie Finch, Eleanor's assistant, had apparently made several nervous corrections to her initial statement when questioned more thoroughly, ultimately admitting that she had seen Eleanor return to the house at approximately 10:15, and that Eleanor had entered through the library's French doors rather than through the main entrance, a detail that Eleanor had failed to mention in her initial account. It was also revealed that Marjorie had been in the house that morning, contrary to Eleanor's assertion that only she and the household staff had been present, as she had come early to collect some documents that Eleanor had requested. When Sergeant Price described these various inconsistencies, Miss Marple listened with the air of someone processing information rather than drawing conclusions, though her mind was already constructing a framework that incorporated these details into a more coherent narrative. She asked several careful questions about the state of Eleanor Whitmore's shoes and clothing when Marjorie had seen her entering through the French doors, about the nature of the documents that Marjorie had come to collect, about the specific details of Eleanor's demeanor when she had been observed in the kitchen at 9:15, and about whether anyone had actually seen Edmund Harrow returning to the house after his walk in the gardens. Each question seemed innocuous, yet each elicited information that Sergeant Price himself had not thought to pursue with sufficient rigor. Miss Marple also inquired about David Whitmore's movements on the morning of the murder, asking whether he had been present in the house, and if so, whether he had been observed entering or exiting the library at any point. Sergeant Price admitted that David had been somewhat evasive about the specifics of his morning, claiming that he had been in his room working on correspondence, but acknowledging that he had not been observed by any staff member during the relevant time period. When questioned more directly about whether he had stepped outside the house at all, David had initially denied it, but had later admitted to a brief walk in the gardens, ostensibly for the purpose of taking exercise and clearing his head, though he had been vague about the precise timing of this walk and about whether he had ventured near the library. As Sergeant Price recounted these details, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious parallel between David's behavior and the patterns she had observed in several previous cases, the way that guilt often prompted elaborate explanations and subsequent revisions, the manner in which innocent individuals usually maintained their initial, straightforward statements unless confronted with contradictory evidence. Yet she also considered the possibility that David's evasiveness might stem from an entirely different source than murderous intent, something perhaps more embarrassing or socially problematic than homicide, a distinction that mattered considerably for the purposes of justice. By the time Sergeant Price departed her sitting room on Saturday morning, he seemed to be laboring under a considerably heavier burden of uncertainty than when he had arrived, though he also seemed energized by the prospect of asking new questions and pursuing lines of inquiry that had previously escaped his attention. The weekend passed with the peculiar tension that accompanied an active murder investigation in a small village, a tension that manifested itself in excessive civility, meaningful silences, and the kind of intense scrutiny that neighbors directed toward one another when the possibility existed that one of them might be a murderer. The Sunday service at St. Mary Mead's Parish Church was attended by an unusually large congregation, though whether this represented genuine religious devotion or merely the desire to observe one's fellow villagers in a setting where their emotions might betray themselves was a matter of some debate. Miss Marple attended, as she always did, and noted with her characteristic precision the various reactions displayed by those connected to the Whitmore family and the manor. Eleanor Whitmore herself was present, dressed entirely in black in what seemed to be an excess of mourning, even for a murdered brother, her posture rigid, and her attention apparently focused on the hymnal in front of her despite the fact that she did not appear to be singing. David Whitmore sat several pews behind his aunt, his expression troubled and his attention seemingly fixed on Dr. Sarah Ashton, who sat with her parents in the front section reserved for the more prominent families of the parish. David's gaze was neither surreptitious nor entirely open, but rather occupied that peculiar middle ground of someone observing another person while hoping not to be observed in turn. Marjorie Finch sat alone, her small frame diminished further by the vastness of the church pew, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and her eyes occasionally darting toward Eleanor, as though seeking reassurance or direction. Colin Hayes attended with his mother, a pleasant woman of middle years who seemed entirely unaware of the tension surrounding her son, though Colin himself appeared acutely conscious of being the subject of considerable attention and speculation, his jaw set and his shoulders tensed in a posture of defensive resolution. Thomas and Margaret Carstairs occupied their usual pew with an appearance of perfect composure, though Miss Marple noted that Margaret's hand occasionally sought Thomas's arm, a gesture that suggested a need for reassurance rather than mere affection. It was during the interval between the service and the subsequent social gathering in the church hall that Miss Marple engineered what appeared to be a chance encounter with Marjorie Finch near the vestry, though in truth she had positioned herself with considerable precision to ensure such an encounter. Marjorie seemed startled to find herself in conversation with Miss Marple, and her initial responses were hesitant and guarded, though Miss Marple's gentle manner and apparent interest in matters entirely unrelated to the murder investigation gradually encouraged the younger woman to relax her defensive posture. Miss Marple inquired about the documents that Marjorie had come to collect on the morning of Edmund's death, asking whether they had been of particular importance and whether Elia, nor had seemed anxious or distressed when requesting them. Marjorie's initial response was vague, suggesting that the documents had been routine correspondence, though when Miss Marple pressed gently with the observation that it seemed unusual for Eleanor to request documents on the morning of an important festival, Marjorie's resistance began to crumble. She confessed, in a voice barely above a whisper, that the documents had not been routine correspondence at all, but rather financial records related to the property transaction between Eleanor and Edmund regarding the manor's ownership. Apparently, Edmund had been attempting to force a sale of the manor to cover gambling debts that he had accumulated in London, debts that were considerable and that had attracted the attention of some rather unsavory individuals. Eleanor had been fiercely resistant to this plan, as the manor was not only her residence, but also represented the family's primary asset and the foundation of her identity within the village. The documents that Marjorie had retrieved were drafts of a revised will that Eleanor had been considering, a will that would transfer the manor not to David, her nearest blood relation, but to a distant cousin in Scotland, a move that would effectively prevent Edmund from selling the property even after Eleanor's death. When Miss Marple asked whether Eleanor had seemed relieved or distressed upon receiving these documents, Marjorie hesitated, and then admitted that Eleanor had seemed neither relieved nor distressed, but rather grim and resolved, as though she had made a decision of considerable consequence and was prepared to live with whatever consequences that decision might entail. This revelation, though obviously offered with considerable reluctance and accompanied by Marjorie's obvious distress at having betrayed Eleanor's confidence, provided Miss Marple with a crucial piece of the puzzle that had been troubling her. She thanked Marjorie gently, assured her that her confidence would be respected, and observed that it must be difficult for a young woman to be placed in such an awkward position between her employer and her conscience. By the time she had finished her conversation with Marjorie and had returned to her seat in the church hall for the subsequent social gathering, Miss Marple's understanding of the crime had shifted considerably, though she remained careful to give no outward indication of this shift. She found herself observing Eleanor Whitmore with renewed attention, considering the woman not as a potential murderer, but rather as someone who might have had compelling reasons to wish her brother dead, yet who also possessed the kind of iron control that might allow her to orchestrate such a death with meticulous precision, while maintaining an appearance of shocked innocence. She also found herself reconsidering David Whitmore's evasiveness, wondering whether his secretive walk in the gardens might have been connected not to the murder itself, but to some other preoccupation entirely, perhaps an attempt to meet Dr. Ashton at a location where they might not be observed, or an effort to gather something from the gardens for reasons entirely unrelated to Edmund's death. The following morning, Monday, brought news that the county police had completed their analysis of the poison and had determined its exact composition and the probable method of administration. It had been introduced into Edmund's breakfast coffee, which meant that the murder must have been accomplished by someone with access to the manor's kitchen and dining facilities during the morning hours. This narrowed the field of suspects considerably, as the kitchen had been occupied by Mrs. Brown, the cook, throughout the morning, and she had been adamant that she had prepared Edmund's coffee in her usual manner and that no one had accessed it before Edmund consumed it. Yet someone, somehow, had introduced the poison into that coffee, and Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the coffee itself was the significant detail or whether some other explanation might account for the poison's presence in Edmund's system, an explanation that had nothing to do with breakfast and everything to do with misdirection and carefully constructed assumptions. By Tuesday morning, the investigation had taken on an air of increasing frustration, as Sergeant Price seemed no closer to identifying the murderer despite the considerable narrowing of the field of suspects. The poison had been definitively introduced into Edmund's breakfast coffee, yet Mrs. Brown, the cook, maintained with absolute consistency that she had prepared the coffee in the presence of no one else, and that it had been consumed by Edmund immediately upon his arrival in the dining room at approximately 8 o'clock. Edmund's housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Ashworth, who maintained his London residence, and who had been visiting the manor to arrange some matters, had been questioned extensively and had proven to have no motive whatsoever, as she had been entirely unaware of Edmund's gambling debts and had been friendly with all parties involved. The household staff, when questioned about their observations of Edmund's movements and demeanor on the morning of his death, had provided consistent accounts that suggested Edmund had been in good spirits, had eaten his breakfast without apparent concern, and had subsequently gone for his walk in the gardens. The puzzle that confronted Sergeant Price was therefore one of considerable complexity. Someone had poisoned Edmund's coffee, yet that someone appeared to have no opportunity to do so, and the poison had presumably taken. In effect, during Edmund's walk in the gardens, as his body had not been discovered until he collapsed in the library several hours after consuming the poisoned beverage. It was during one of Sergeant Price's increasingly frequent visits to Miss Marple's sitting room that the crucial conversation occurred, a conversation that began innocuously enough with Miss Marple asking whether the toxicology examination had revealed anything about the rate at which the poison would have taken effect. Sergeant Price explained that the poison was of a type that acted gradually, with death typically occurring 4 to 6 hours after ingestion, depending on various factors including the victim's physical condition, metabolism, and the exact quantity consumed. This meant that Edmund could have consumed the poison at 8 o'clock, walked in the gardens at 9:30, and collapsed in the library at approximately 12 o'clock, a timeline that perfectly accommodated all the observed facts. Miss Marple then asked a question that seemed almost idle, a mere matter of clarification, yet which would prove to be the crucial pivot upon which the entire investigation would turn. She inquired whether the poison had been analyzed for its exact chemical composition, and whether it was possible to determine whether it had been introduced into the coffee in its pure form, or whether it might have been mixed with some other substance that would mask its bitter taste and make it more palatable to drink without suspicion. Sergeant Price admitted that the poison itself had a distinctly unpleasant taste, and that it seemed unlikely that Edmund would have willingly consumed a cup of coffee flavored with such a substance without comment. Miss Marple then asked whether the coffee itself had been analyzed for any unusual additives, and Sergeant Price confessed that no such analysis had been performed, as attention had focused entirely on the poison, rather than on the medium by which it had been delivered. Miss Marple suggested, very gently, that it might be worth examining whether the coffee had contained any substance that might mask or modify the taste of the poison, such as a particularly strong cream, or perhaps a flavoring agent of some kind. This suggestion proved to be the small thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire carefully constructed narrative of the crime. Upon investigation, it was discovered that Mrs. Brown, the cook, customarily added a small amount of strong chicory essence to Edmund's morning coffee, a practice that Edmund had requested years previously and which had become so routine that it was rarely remarked upon. This chicory essence, which had a bitter flavor of its own, would have masked the taste of the plant-based poison quite effectively, making it possible for the poison to be introduced into the coffee without Edmund's immediate detection. Furthermore, examination of the chicory essence bottle itself revealed traces of the poison, suggesting that someone had introduced the poison not into Edmund's specific cup of coffee, but rather into the shared bottle of chicory essence that was used in the preparation of all morning beverages in the Whitmore Manor kitchen. This revelation shifted the entire focus of the investigation, as it meant that the murderer did not need to have been present in the dining room at the moment Edmund consumed his coffee, but rather only needed to have access to the kitchen and the ability to doctor the chicory essence bottle without being observed. Mrs. Brown, when confronted with this evidence, broke down completely and admitted that she had noticed the bottle had been tampered with on the morning in question, that she had observed a small quantity of an unfamiliar substance at the bottom of the bottle, but that she had assumed it was merely some natural settling of the essence and had not thought it significant enough to mention. The question that now confronted Sergeant Price was therefore not how the poison had been administered, but rather who had possessed the opportunity and the motive to introduce it into the chicory essence bottle. The kitchen, though supervised by Mrs. Brown, had been entered by various individuals throughout the early morning hours. Eleanor Whitmore had been there at 9:15, discussing festival preparations. David Whitmore had passed through at approximately 8:45, according to the cook's account, requesting a tray to be sent to his room. Marjorie Finch had been present at approximately 7:30, arriving early to collect those crucial documents. Even Colin Hayes, the groundskeeper, had entered through the kitchen door at approximately 8 o'clock to collect some supplies for work in the gardens. Yet none of these individuals seemed to have had any reason to specifically target Edmund with a poison that, while slow-acting, would have been equally lethal to anyone else who consumed the chicory-flavored coffee. Miss Marple, when informed of these details, listened with her characteristic attention and then asked a question that revealed the true complexity of the murderer's design. She inquired whether anyone had tested whether the chicory essence had been the intended target or whether perhaps the poison had been introduced into some other substance in the kitchen, a substance that might have allowed the murderer to achieve a specific target while creating the impression of a more random act. This question proved sufficiently provocative that Sergeant Price ordered a comprehensive analysis of all substances present in the manor's kitchen, an undertaking that revealed a curious detail that had previously escaped notice. While the poison in the chicory essence was genuine, there was also a trace of the same poison present in a small container of honey that sat on the kitchen shelf, a container that was used exclusively by Eleanor Whitmore in her morning tea. This discovery indicated that the murderer had employed a strategy of redundancy, poisoning multiple potential vectors simultaneously in order to ensure that Edmund would be exposed to the lethal substance regardless of which specific breakfast beverage he might have consumed. Yet this revelation raised a troubling question, for if the poison had been introduced into both the chicory essence and Eleanor's personal honey jar, then either the murderer had been extraordinarily careless in their choice of targets, or the poison in Eleanor's honey was itself a form of misdirection designed to implicate her in a crime that she had not committed. Miss Marple found herself considering this possibility with considerable interest, as it suggested a level of psychological sophistication that went beyond mere murder and entered the realm of deliberate frame construction, a technique that she had encountered before and which typically indicated a murderer of considerable intelligence and calculated intent. She therefore made a suggestion to Sergeant Price that seemed to contradict the apparent evidence, proposing that he focus his attention not on determining who had access to the chicory essence and the honey, but rather on understanding who would have possessed both the knowledge and the motive to introduce poison into Eleanor's personal honey jar, while simultaneously introducing poison into the chicory essence bottle. This seemingly paradoxical approach proved to be precisely the correct one, for it led Sergeant Price to examine the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's morning routine with considerably greater care than he had previously employed. It transpired that Eleanor had consumed no honey that morning, having instead taken her tea with lemon, as Mrs. Brown confirmed. Furthermore, Eleanor had not been present in the kitchen during the time when the honey jar would have been poisoned, according to the cook's account. This suggested that whoever had poisoned the honey jar had done so with the explicit knowledge that Eleanor would not consume it, which in turn suggested that the poisoning of the honey jar had been deliberately designed to implicate Eleanor in the crime. The implications of this realization were profound, for they indicated that the true murderer was someone who possessed detailed knowledge not only of Edmund's morning routine, but also of Eleanor's morning routine, and someone who harbored sufficient animosity toward Eleanor to wish to see her implicated in her own brother's murder. These characteristics pointed quite specifically toward a small subset of individuals, and Miss Marple found herself focusing her attention on those who maintained intimate knowledge of the manor's household routines and who had reason to harbor grievances against Eleanor, a category that included Marjorie Finch, Colin Hayes, and potentially David Whitmore, though for quite different reasons in each case. Miss Marple requested a private interview with Sergeant Price on Thursday afternoon, and when he arrived at her sitting room, she proceeded to lay out a theory that seemed to defy the evidence that had been so carefully assembled. She proposed that the murder of Edmund Harrow had been carried out not by Eleanor Whitmore, who had been the obvious beneficiary of her brother's death, and who had been the object of the frame construction, but rather by someone else entirely, someone who had deliberately created the appearance of Eleanor's involvement in order to advance their own designs. She suggested that this person had possessed considerable knowledge of the manor's routines, had understood the significance of the chicory essence and the honey jar, and had possessed sufficient access to the kitchen to poison both substances without being observed in the act. She further proposed that the motive for the crime had not been financial, despite Edmund's gambling debts, but rather personal, rooted in some form of emotional entanglement or resentment that had accumulated over time and that had finally reached a breaking point. When Sergeant Price asked whom she suspected, Miss Marple offered a response that was at once simple and devastating. She suggested that the murderer was someone whose presence in the manor had become so routine that their movements through the kitchen had ceased to be remarked upon or questioned, someone whose access to the household supplies was so taken for granted that no one thought to monitor their interactions with those supplies, and someone who had harbored a deep resentment toward Edmund specifically because of his involvement in financial dealings that had affected someone they cared about deeply. She then proposed that the poison had been introduced into both the chicory essence and the honey jar, not to create redundancy but rather to accomplish two distinct purposes. The chicory essence had been poisoned to kill Edmund, while the honey jar had been poisoned to implicate Eleanor and thereby to ensure that the investigation would focus on her guilt rather than on the circumstances surrounding the actual murderer's motive and method. Sergeant Price listened to this theory with the expression of a man grappling with a fundamental reorientation of his understanding, and when Miss Marple finally revealed whom she believed to be responsible for the crime, he initially resisted the conclusion, finding it impossible to reconcile with his previous assessment of the suspect's character and motivation. Yet as Miss Marple walked him through the evidence piece by piece, showing him how each detail fit into a coherent pattern that he had previously failed to perceive, his resistance gradually crumbled into acceptance. By the time he departed her sitting room, Sergeant Price had begun to understand that the most important aspect of murder investigation was not the accumulation of physical evidence, but rather the careful observation of human behavior and the recognition that people were rarely where they appeared to be on the surface. The afternoon of Friday, May 17th, dawned clear and bright, as though the weather itself had decided to mark the occasion with unusual clemency. Sergeant Price, armed with Miss Marple's carefully constructed theory and the evidence that now seemed to support it when viewed from this new perspective, arrived at Thornfield Manor with a warrant and an expression of grim determination. The household was assembled in the drawing room at his request, an assemblage that included Eleanor Whitmore, David Whitmore, Marjorie Finch, Mrs. Brown the cook, the two housemaids, and Colin Hayes the groundskeeper. Miss Marple herself had been invited by Sergeant Price, a circumstance that would have seemed extraordinary had the sergeant not been sufficiently experienced to recognize that her presence might prove invaluable in confirming his understanding of the psychological dimensions of the crime. The sergeant began his address to the assembled group with a careful recitation of the facts, as they had been understood up to that morning, a recitation that seemed to lead inexorably toward Eleanor Whitmore's guilt. He described the poisoned chicory essence, the poisoned honey jar, Eleanor's financial motive stemming from Edmund's attempt to force a sale of the manor, the documents pertaining to the revised will that Marjorie had retrieved that morning. As he spoke, Eleanor's face grew increasingly pale, and David placed a protective hand on his aunt's shoulder, while Marjorie looked down at her lap with an expression of deep distress. Yet Sergeant Price had not finished his exposition, and, as he continued, the focus of his investigation shifted with subtle but unmistakable clarity. He turned his attention to the matter of who had actually poisoned the substances in the kitchen, and he presented new evidence that had emerged from a careful review. The household routines and access patterns. It emerged that while several people had entered the kitchen that morning, only one person had been present in the kitchen at the specific moments when both the chicory essence bottle and the honey jar would have needed to be doctored. That person was not Eleanor Whitmore, nor was it David or Marjorie, nor was it any of the household staff. Rather, it was someone whose presence in the kitchen had become so routine that it had been rendered nearly invisible by familiarity, someone whose movements through the household were so taken for granted that no one thought to question them. Sergeant Price then revealed that he had interviewed a certain individual at considerable length regarding their movements on the morning of Edmund S. death, an individual who had initially provided a straightforward account, but whose story had begun to unravel when subjected to careful scrutiny. This person had admitted, under gentle but persistent questioning, to having been in the kitchen at the precise time when the poison could have been introduced into the chicory essence in the honey jar. More significantly, this person had admitted to harboring considerable resentment toward Edmund Harrow, stemming from a financial transaction that had caused considerable harm to someone they loved deeply. As Sergeant Price spoke these words, he turned his attention directly toward Colin Hayes, the young groundskeeper who had been present in the manor that morning to collect supplies for his work in the gardens. Colin's face underwent a sudden transformation, the carefully maintained composure that he had displayed throughout the investigation crumbling into an expression of raw anguish and despair. He stood abruptly, knocking over the chair behind him, and for a moment it seemed that he might attempt to flee the room, but instead he simply covered his face with his hands and made a sound somewhere between a cry and a moan. It was at this precise moment that Miss Marple intervened with a gentle question that seemed to address not the guilt or innocence of Colin Hayes, but rather the deeper emotional truth that underlay the crime. She asked Colin quietly whether his mother knew about the financial difficulties that had plagued his family in recent years, whether she was aware that Edmund Harrow had purchased the family cottage at a vastly inflated price and then immediately sold it to developers at a substantial profit, thereby depriving the Hayes family of the modest nest egg they had accumulated. Colin's response was to finally break his silence and to confess, in a voice that carried all the pain of accumulated resentment and desperation, that Edmund's actions had destroyed his mother's financial security, that she had been forced to seek work as a domestic servant in her own advancing years, and that Colin could not bear to witness the slow erosion of her dignity and independence. He had poisoned Edmund in a moment of clarity in which he had recognized that his mother's suffering would continue indefinitely unless Edmund was removed from her life, and, more importantly, unless the financial assets that Edmund had stolen could somehow be recovered for the family's benefit. Colin's confession was not one of sudden passion or momentary rage, but rather of calculated determination which made it all the more tragic in its implications. Yet, as the constables led him away to await formal charges, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious manner in which the frame had been constructed, the deliberate poisoning of Eleanor's honey jar while simultaneously poisoning the chicory essence, an arrangement that had suggested to her that the true murderer intended for Eleanor to be implicated in the crime. She turned to Sergei N.T. Price and asked a final question, the answer to which would illuminate the psychological dimensions of Colin's murder. She asked whether Colin had been present in the kitchen at any time when Eleanor's honey jar might have been poisoned, whether his access to Eleanor's personal items in the kitchen had been such that he could have introduced the poison without Eleanor's knowledge. Colin, overhearing this question as he was being led from the room, paused and then provided an answer that explained everything. He confessed that he had indeed poisoned Eleanor's honey jar with the deliberate intention of implicating her in the crime, not out of malice toward Eleanor herself, but because he understood that if Eleanor were imprisoned for Edmund's murder, then the manor and its considerable value would pass to David Whitmore, with whom Colin had made a private arrangement, whereby David would help recover the family cottage and restore the Hayes family's financial position in exchange for Colin's silence regarding the source of the poison and the manner of its administration. The revelation of Colin's arrangement with David Whitmore sent a considerable shock through the assembled group, and it became immediately apparent that Sergeant Price's investigation had merely scratched the surface of a considerably more complex web of conspiracy and complicity than had initially been apparent. David's face underwent a transformation as dramatic as Colin's had, moving from protective concern for his aunt to something far more sinister, a mask slipping away to reveal the calculating individual that lay beneath. He made an attempt to deny Colin's assertion, claiming that whatever arrangement they might have discussed had been nothing more than idle conversation. Yet the constables who had been stationed near the door to the drawing room moved swiftly to prevent his departure, and it be came clear that Sergeant Price had anticipated precisely this possibility. Miss Marple, observing the unfolding drama with the composed attention that had become her hallmark, found her attention drawn not to David or Colin, but rather to Eleanor Whitmore, whose reaction to these revelations seemed notably more complex than simple shock or relief at being exonerated. Eleanor's face bore an expression that suggested she was processing information that, while devastating, was not entirely surprising to her, as though some suspicion regarding David's character or motivations had been confirmed rather than introduced for the first time. When Sergeant Price turned to address Eleanor directly, asking whether she had suspected her nephew's involvement in some form of conspiracy, Eleanor took a considerable time before responding, and when she finally did speak, her voice carried a weight of resignation that suggested a profound disappointment in human nature itself. She confessed that she had harbored suspicions regarding David's financial arrangements for some time, that she had observed certain irregularities in the manor's accounts that suggested he had been transferring funds to individuals outside the family, and that she had become increasingly convinced that his arrival in Thornfield 6 months prior had been motivated not by a genuine desire for family connection, but rather by some scheme that she had not fully understood. Eleanor's confession that she had been aware of David's questionable activities, yet had failed to take decisive action against them, seemed to cause her considerable emotional distress, as though she recognized that her inaction had contributed, however indirectly, to the circumstances that had led to Edmund's death. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple made an observation that seemed to cut through the layers of conspiracy and complicity to react. The deeper truth of the matter, she noted, with her characteristic gentleness, that Eleanor's revised will, which she had instructed Marjorie to draft on the morning of Edmund's death, had presumably been motivated not merely by Edmund's attempt to force a sale of the manor, but also by a growing recognition that David's presence in the household represented a threat to the manor's long-term security. Eleanor acknowledged this assessment with a nod, and it became clear that the morning of Edmund's death had been marked not only by a murder, but also by a series of revelations that had fundamentally altered Eleanor's understanding of her family and her responsibilities to the manor that she had stewards for so many years. The subsequent investigation into David's financial activities revealed a considerably more elaborate scheme of fraud and misappropriation than anyone had initially suspected. David had been using his position as manager of the Whitmore family's interests to redirect funds toward a property development scheme in which he held a hidden financial stake, a scheme that stood to generate considerable profits once certain local planning permissions had been obtained. Colin Hayes and his mother had been drawn into this scheme through the promise of financial recovery, with Colin being offered a substantial payment in exchange for his willingness to testify that Eleanor had been responsible for Edmund's death, thereby ensuring that the investigation would be directed away from David and toward his aunt. The beauty of the scheme, from David's perspective, was that once Eleanor had been imprisoned for the murder, the manor and its assets would pass to him as the sole remaining member of the immediate family, providing him with the resources necessary to complete his property development scheme and to establish himself as a man of considerable wealth and influence. Yet the scheme had failed fundamentally, not because of any error on David's part, but because of Miss Marple's seemingly tangential observations regarding the poisoned honey jar and what it implied about the true murderer's intentions. Sergeant Price, in his subsequent statement to the assembled group, made a point of emphasizing that the investigation had succeeded only because of Miss Marple's willingness to consider possibilities that seemed to contradict the most obvious interpretations of the evidence. He noted that without her insight into the psychological dimensions of the crime, the investigation might well have focused exclusively on Eleanor Whitmore and would have resulted in the imprisonment of an innocent woman while the true murderer and his conspirators had escaped justice. As the constables led both Colin Hayes and David Whitmore away from Thornfield Manor, the drawing room seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief mixed with something far more troubling, a recognition that the bonds of family and community could be fractured in ways that left permanent scars. Eleanor Whitmore sat in silence for a considerable time, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality of exhaustion that transcended mere physical fatigue. She thanked Sergeant Price for his thorough investigation and acknowledged Miss Marple's crucial role in uncovering the truth, yet her expression suggested that the resolution of the murder investigation had brought her no genuine satisfaction or relief. Rather, it seemed as though the revelations regarding her nephew's character and her own inadequate response to the signs of his corruption had aged her considerably, as though the burden of family responsibility had suddenly become unbearably heavy. Miss Marple, recognizing the depth of Eleanor's distress, approached her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering no platitudes or false assurances, but simply the silent acknowledgement of one person who understood the profound ways in which the discovery of hidden evil could damage the human spirit. The days that followed Edmund Harrow's murder unfolded with the peculiar rhythm that characterized the aftermath of violent crime in small English villages, a rhythm that oscillated between the demands of the legal system and the gradual return to the rhythms of ordinary life. The preliminary hearing was held on the following Tuesday, at which point both Colin Hayes and David Whitmore were formally charged with murder and conspiracy to commit fraud, charges that would likely occupy the attention of the legal system for many months to come. The village, meanwhile, began the slow process of adjusting to the knowledge that two of its residents, one of whom had been a fixture in the community for 6 months and the other for considerably longer, had been engaged in a conspiracy that had ultimately resulted in death. Miss Marple, having completed her role in the investigation and having provided Sergeant Price with the detailed analysis that had led to the identification and apprehension of the murderers, returned to her quiet life in St. Mary Mead with the appearance of someone who had merely taken a brief excursion from her normal routine. Yet those who knew her well, and Sergeant Price certainly counted himself among that small group, understood that something had shifted in her understanding of human nature as a result of the Thornfield investigation, a deepening of her already considerable insight into the ways that desperation and ambition could corrupt even those who seemed to possess some initial moral foundation. The trial itself, when it finally occurred some months later, proved to be considerably less dramatic than the investigation that had preceded it, as David Whitmore's legal representatives negotiated a plea arrangement whereby he agreed to provide testimony regarding Colin Hayes's role in the murder in exchange for a reduced sentence on the fraud charges. Colin, meanwhile, maintained his original confession and displayed throughout the proceedings an almost resigned acceptance of his culpability, as though the act of confessing to the crime had relieved him of some unbearable burden and left him capable of facing the consequences with a measure of dignity that had been absent during the investigation itself. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, made particular note of the psychological dimensions of the crime, observing that Colin Hayes had been driven not by personal greed, but by a desire to restore his family's financial security, and that this motivation, while insufficient to excuse the crime, suggested a complexity of human character that demanded consideration beyond simple condemnation. Colin received a sentence of life imprisonment with a possibility of parole after 25 years, a sentence that seemed to trouble him less than one might have expected, as though he had already made peace with the trajectory of his life and the consequences that would follow from his actions. David Whitmore, by contrast, received a considerably reduced sentence of 12 years, a circumstance that generated considerable local indignation regarding the apparent inequity of the legal system's treatment of murder when combined with fraud rather than when motivated by more understandable emotional circumstances. Eleanor Whitmore, vindicated entirely of any suspicion regarding her brother's death, found herself in the peculiar position of managing not only her own grief at Edmund's murder, but also the profound discomfort that came with recognizing that her own nephew had been willing to see her imprisoned for a crime she had not committed. She established a small trust fund in Colin's mother's name, a gesture that some in the village interpreted as guilt for David's actions and others interpreted as Eleanor's characteristic generosity toward those who had suffered misfortune through no fault of their own. Thornfield Manor, once a site of such tragedy and revelation, gradually returned to its former status as a peaceful country estate, though the memories of what had transpired within its walls would linger for generations in the collective consciousness of the village. The final conversation between Miss Marple and Sergeant Price occurred on a warm afternoon in early autumn, some months after the trial had concluded and the village had begun its slow return to the rhythms of ordinary life. Sergeant Price had called at Miss Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, and they sat together in her garden, observing the changing colours of the season with the companionable silence that had developed between them over the course of their collaboration. When Sergeant Price finally spoke, his words seemed to address not merely the specific crimes of Colin Hayes and David Whitmore, but rather the broader philosophical questions that murder investigation necessarily raised regarding the nature of human character and the circumstances that drove individuals toward violence. He asked Miss Marple whether she believed that Colin Hayes was fundamentally a criminal or whether he was simply an ordinary person who had been driven to extraordinary actions by a combination of desperation and opportunity. Miss Marple's response was characteristically measured and thoughtful, acknowledging that this was perhaps the fundamental question that all murder investigation ultimately confronted, and that the answer was rarely as simple as the legal system required it to be. She observed that in her long experience of observing human nature, she had calm. To recognize that most people contained within themselves the potential for both great kindness and terrible cruelty, and that the circumstances of their lives often determined which of these potentials would ultimately come to expression. She noted that Colin Hayes had committed a terrible crime, yet that crime had emerged not from some inherent wickedness, but rather from a combination of genuine compassion for his mother and a misguided belief that murder could solve problems that were fundamentally social and economic in nature. As the afternoon light lengthened across Miss Marple's garden, Sergeant Price found himself reflecting on the ways that the investigation into Edmund Harrow's death had altered his understanding of his profession and his responsibilities as a guardian of justice. He recognized that the solution to crime was not merely the apprehension of those who committed violent acts, but rather a deeper understanding of the social circumstances that made such acts possible or probable. Miss Marple, listening to these reflections with her characteristic attention, smiled gently and observed that such understanding was perhaps the highest form of wisdom that an investigator could achieve, and that it was considerably more valuable than any number of solved cases or guilty verdicts. As Sergeant Price departed her garden, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Miss Marple reflected that the murder of Edmund Harrow had ultimately been less about the acquisition of wealth or the advancement of personal schemes than about the profound human need to protect those we love from suffering, even when the methods we employ in service of that protection are fundamentally destructive. The village of Thornfield would gradually recover from the trauma of the murder and the revelations that had followed. Yet something essential had shifted in the community's understanding of itself. The comfortable assumptions about the goodness and stability of community life had been shattered, replaced by a more mature recognition that evil could flourish in the most peaceful and beautiful of settings, that human nature contained depths of both nobility and corruption that could rarely be fully known until tested by circumstance. Miss Marple knitted in her garden as autumn deepened into winter, and the rhythms of village life slowly reasserted themselves, yet she carried with her always the memory of Edmund Harrow and the various individuals whose lives had been forever altered by his death, a reminder that beneath the surface of every peaceful community lay hidden passions and secret resentments that required only the right catalyst to emerge into terrible actuality.